Hello, friends, and welcome to the City of the Immaculata, a channel where we discuss history and theology. If you've been enjoying this series of videos, I ask that you like the video, and if you haven't already, consider subscribing or sharing it with others. Thank you. We continue our talk on Lakota Catholicism, a history of the church among the Plains Indians. So far, we have discussed Part 1, Origins and Spirituality, Part 2, Black Robes and Conversions, Part 3, Nicholas Black Elk, and I really ask if you haven't watched those yet before watching this next one to go back and watch those. One of the reasons is that because of where we're going to be moving with this particular video, I want to make sure that you have the full context of where we're coming from before you watch this. And also, we're going to be shifting gears a little bit here because while the story of Nicholas Black Elk, for example, is one of inspiration and excitement, this one has a markedly much more somber tone to it. And today we're going to be looking at the boarding schools controversy. I want to add some preliminary remarks. I almost bailed on doing this one, guys. For one, I purposely refrained from using my channel as a platform for scandal and controversy mongering, even though that's ironically one of the things that really seems to generate views and subscribers. As God is my witness, I'd rather have this channel fail and die before I engage in that, what I see other primarily, well, especially Catholic YouTube channels engaging in. Two, I question whether it's my place to even tell this story. I'm not Lakota. I don't have any relatives that were affected by this, and it's a subject that, in all honesty, is larger than one that I can tackle with justice to all sides. And who am I to take this on and think I'll do anything other than bring up traumatic events while also potentially scandalizing other Catholics? But I also think that to take this project on, to have taken this series on, and to not cover this particular event would be to leave a glaring hole in the narrative. One that more Catholics should be aware exists, if for no other reason than to maybe help your fellow Catholics in their healing process. So, with that said, before I go further, I'm going to do something I haven't done yet on this channel, and I'm going to add a disclaimer. I'm sensitive to trauma, having dealt with it in my own life, and I don't want to use this event that has already brought to the surface verifiable tragedies, especially in Canada and even here in the US. I don't want to use that as a as an opportunity to sensationalize another person's suffering. So, as a warning, I'm going to say that we're going to be discussing traumatic events that affect living people, the boarding schools. If you have suffered trauma from events that took place at the boarding schools, it's recommended that you don't watch this video. If you do watch it anyways, and you find that it triggers your trauma, please, I ask that you go and seek the proper help. I realize that there are people alive today that lived through this or had parents or grandparents that they loved and spoke with about these events that are affected by this. And I really want to do my due diligence to make sure that what I'm doing moving ahead with this video doesn't open up wounds that maybe you have worked on healing or that you haven't dealt with yet. This is a public video. I'm just putting it out here on YouTube. I don't know who's going to run across it. So I want to make sure that you're clear that I would prefer to have those individuals not watch this video because I don't know what specific areas would affect you as an individual if you suffer trauma from this. So I don't, while I don't sensationalize the events, I also haven't done enough one on one. I'm not an expert, obviously, in trauma, and I haven't done enough one on one with people to know where to be more sensitive and maybe edit out things that would affect people that are alive today. The other thing is to you Catholics who are watching this that are maybe unaware of what happened. Now, I've had interactions, even recently, discussing this where otherwise well meaning Catholics want to deny that these things happened, or worse, blame the victims as if the victims themselves either deserved it or brought it upon themselves. And I can understand that tendency to, as the children of Noah wanted to cover their father's nakedness, to want to protect Holy Mother Church from eyes and ears and mouths that would speak ill against it and try to harm the church. But we know from the abuse scandals that the church in temporal matters can fail. So I just want you to realize, that there are people that are living or who have close relatives that were traumatized and affected by this. And many of them are your brother and sister Catholics. And they deserve to be heard. The story deserves to be uncovered, and lessons should be learned from what happened. In my years of research, beside just the human tragedy of all of this, one of the greatest sadnesses is that when you look at history, the narrative many of us were raised on, that the forces of colonialism precipitated this fatalistic trajectory towards violence and conflict and injustice, it just doesn't hold up. In actuality, there were often relations built on peace and trade and cultural intermingling between the natives and the Europeans. The circumstances that led to the treatment of the Native Americans by the United States government and by the Canadian government, Europeans by Europeans in general too, was by no means the only outcome. And in hindsight, it was a missed opportunity for us as Christians, as Catholics, to bring Christ and his church to a people that, as we have been discussing for at length at this point in this series, a people that were already responding favorably to that message. Now, admittedly, there are forces that are at play that are beyond the powers of the family, that are certainly beyond the powers of the children, and that are often at times beyond the powers of the missionaries themselves. And while that explains, it doesn't excuse. And I'm going to do the best that I can to explain these events without excusing them. And I'm going to withhold as best as I can any editorializing or giving my own opinion as best I can. So, one thing to consider before we even really move into this is the differences between the Indian and African experience here on the American continent. Now, while they're often kind of lumped together, it is really two very different stories. The Africans were taken from their ancestral homes, brought over an entire ocean, and placed squarely in the middle of a foreign culture. And a foreign culture that the people that brought them there was foreign to them as well. The experience of Europeans and Africans on this continent is one of two peoples coming to know the land and each other at the same time. And the US, it's way too long to get into here, but the United States has always been this hybrid of European and African influences, dominated by European customs, undoubtedly, but always interlaced with the wide variety of African customs that seeped into the culture. Native Americans, on the other hand, were already here. And while it was a fluid situation for any given tribe, even before the arrival of Europeans, once we were here, the general trend moved ever towards displacement and a certain de Indianizing of the native peoples, where, unlike the African, who I want to say did, without a doubt, lose some of their identity, still admirably managed to retain and influence the West. The policy towards the Native Americans, especially later on, became one of an intentional cultural eradication. And just for example, looking at this from a broad scope, just take, for example, the traditional Lakota way of life versus the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant standards. Could you have a greater disparity between two types of people than what you have here? Where the European, especially this to become dominated by this English Protestant work ethic of ever towards social mobility, higher social mobility, towards technological and um, industrial advancements, to where we built, wherever we landed, we built these major cities. And just as these cities rose towards the sky, the English Protestant ethic was always one of constant work, constant attention paid to one's advancement of one's career, and that was sort of how one's identity came about. Whereas the traditional Lakota way of life was on the prairie. One might have to work for, say, the time it took to bring down a bison, to bring that bison back to the camp, to dismember it and use its meat and its fur and everything for the clothing that you would have to make. Several hours of work for sure, sometimes intensive work for sure, but beyond that, the life was much more leisurely. There was much more time given to recreation, to ceremony, to family, to the tribe in general. Just an absolutely different way of life altogether. So, because of this, early on, the U.S. policy towards the Native American was one of moving them into the reservations and forcing assimilation. Whereas the blending of European and African cultures was more organic, and it took place over decades and even centuries. The policy towards the natives was infamously stated by the superintendent of the Carlisle's school on the Pennsylvania reservation, Captain Richard Henry Pratt, who infamously said that the policy towards the children that come into the boarding schools is kill the Indian, save the man. That is, destroy any semblance of that traditional way of life that they had and save the man and rebuild that man into a model of European, particularly WASP standards. This is coming from someone who was at the time seen as was considered progressive and a friend of the Indians. This was the quote of Pratt, who was the superintendent of one of the very first schools, boarding schools in the United States. So, of course, from the word go, as some of you are aware, the bureaucracy is tasked with the Indians had a reputation as being crooked, as being inefficient, and just all around unrepresentative and deleterious towards the Native Americans themselves, constantly misallocating funds for themselves, as well as using those funds to coerce natives to follow the Bureau's corrupt policies. I mean, you can see here, this is an early 20th century cartoon. It was already well known at the time that the people that were in charge of running these agencies were infamously getting wealthy and fat um, off of the goods and the funds that are being sent to the Native American policies, whereas the Native Americans themselves were oftentimes starving. Just for example, with that in mind, there was a certain well-known practice of withholding food rations unless the people themselves complied with sending their children to the boarding schools. All you have to do is read S.W. Gwynn's History of the Comanche. You'll get an idea of just how convoluted and mishandled the Native American affairs were. And where often the most well meaning of agency men were overruled by the corrupt machine that was late 19th century US politics. Gwen does a wonderful job of showing how even the ones that come in and make decent, at least on paper, decent treaties with the tribes, these men would often go back to DC and they would be up against this machine that would take advantage of the fact that the natives signed a treaty, but then turn around and go against everything that the treaty had agreed to. This was commonplace across the board. And it's not uncommon even to this day to find situations like this, where you may have on any given reservation a government building that is ever furnished and modern on a reservation where a local school may have a falling roof. Now, I know I've heard before the argument, well, what about the casinos? Well, the casinos, despite what some of you may believe, only make up roughly 30 to 40% of, they're only found on 30 to 40% of all reservations in the United States. They're not as common as some are led to believe. And even with the reservations that have built the casinos, there's oftentimes there's oftentimes disparity there as well that we're just not going to get into here. But just keep in mind that this is a long-standing history that we're dealing with here. So we've talked about it at length. If you haven't seen it, go back and watch the first few videos. The Catholics among the Lakota have a long history, and coming all the way up to this point, the the wars with the United States government are coming to an end, and the missions are doing the work that they can do within Lakota country. Now, in 1874, the Catholic Church formed a Bureau of Catholic Indian Missions as a lobbying agency in Washington, D.C. for to help lobby for Catholic missionary efforts in Indian country across the United States. And this became a very important and effective agency. The primary groups responsible for running the schools that would be formed in the Sioux reservations were, as we've discussed already, were the Jesuits. And then also a group of sisters were brought in, the Sisters of St. Francis of Penance and Christian Charity. These would be the groups that were responsible for running the schools that were opening. And among these schools, the most important that was opened was what was known as the Holy Rosary Mission. It's founded in 1888. Interesting little side note is that St. Catherine Drexel helped to finance its building. This is a total side story, but as some of you are probably familiar, St. Catherine was the wealthy heir to an American fortune who used her funds to help, who used the money that she inherited to open up across the country schools that were specifically dedicated towards helping African American children and Native American children. And with the help of Red Cloud, Chief Red Cloud, the Jesuits combined their labor with the locals to build this school. The school, combined with the local farm, was self sufficient enough to house and feed its residents, though we're going to come into some discrepancies about that as well, because there's some convoluted points about that. And despite these successes, the area, we're talking South Dakota here, the area was constantly plagued by states of poverty as well as the outbreak of disease. And to this day, these areas of South Dakota are statistically some of the highest rates of poverty in the country. So, whatever well intentions that we have of these men and women that are involved in forming this mission and building this school, there's much that's outside of their sphere of influence that's affecting the trajectory, the way that things are going to go. Now, officially in 1969, the school was renamed Red Cloud School, and it's still actually operable today. But there's the St. Francis missions, but this is the primary one that we are focused on here today. So, as you can see on this map, the United States by this point had put all of its the tribes that it had been dealing with over the decades onto reservations. And while in theory these reservations were supposed to be acting as autonomous nations, in praxis it was really just impossible. Most of the tribes had lost access to their means of sustenance, and in turn would be forced to look to the US government to subsidize their food, their clothing, their shelter, whatever. At the same time, children are being brought into these schools to be assimilated into the US culture. Infamously, the picture here you're looking at on the right comes from the Pratt School in Pennsylvania. And what he would do was he would take they have a little bit of irony here 100 plus years later, but at the time it was seen as, hey, look what I can do. I can take these people and I can, for what his infamous quote says, I can kill the Indian, I can save the man. So on the Lakota reservations, the sisters, the sisters of St. Francis, reported that when the children would arrive, they would be washed, their old clothes would be discarded, their hair would be cut, and they would be dressed in a European style fashion, much like what you can see here in this picture. Now, the hair especially is a subject that comes up time and again with those who later, as adults, reflected back on these events. Native American societies, almost as a whole, the hair was seen to have great spiritual significance, and it was always treated respectfully. Where it ever cut, it was done ceremonially. And I have heard Basil Braveheart, a Lakota elder, recount how he was traumatized by this. You could see the effect in his face as he's telling the story. They're just little kids, and they've been taught their whole short lives that this is a thing to value and to respect. Then to be brought into this place, he said his hair was cut, there was no explanation given, He watches it drop to the floor where it's discarded in a trash bin. And you can see the effect that this has had on him to this day, retelling this. One point of irony that he pointed out was that as they were cutting his hair, as it was explained that no respectable man had long hair, he would see these Catholic representations of Jesus Christ, always with long hair. One of the reasons why Jesus was so relatable to the natives was that he looked like them. He had long hair, which was very significant and meaningful to the Native American peoples. I'd like to make note that while these schools would have lessons in math, writing, reading, etc., they were more, in fact, industry trade schools, vocational centers, we would call them today. At the time, there was a theory by some that natives and newly freed African Americans needed to be brought up through this process of civilizing that began with learning trades, as they might not be ready yet for the higher learning of white culture. And much of that time was spent laboring, learning trades, working the land for the boys specifically, keeping up with the maintenance of the building. For the girls, there would be sewing, restoring clothes, restoring linens, which, by the way, the child labor was directly used to keep the school functioning. So, where do some of the problems really start coming in? Now, I want to say right off the bat that while I suspect that this particular thing may be one of the key factors to the struggle that the missions had in maintaining open doors and where much of the controversy may arise from, it's within the context of these struggles that I have to add here, they are frustratingly complex. And I say frustrating mostly because if this is where it stems from, if this is where a lot of the problems stem from, it's going to be a nightmare trying to navigate. Much of the work still remains to be done. There are people that are working in the archives. Um, the image that I have here, I borrowed from the work of Gabrielle Guillerme, I think is how you would say her last name. And she is, as of the recording of this video, in the process of going through the archives and recording and bringing and, well, gathering, accumulating, and bringing together what the archives are showing us. So much of this work still remains to be done. And even in deciding for this lecture what to include and what to edit, it's a bit of a minefield. I could lay it all out and do my due diligence for the subject, but in the process lose every single one of you. I could lose all of your attention in the process of trying to bring in every single detail. Now, one of my sources from Ross Enoch's the Jesuit mission of the Lakota Sioux, he does a decent job of pulling together sort of what's taking place. He also takes a generally more favorable light in portraying the Catholic missions as it relates to the boarding schools. And now keep in mind that book was written in the 1990s, so we're a ways out from that, and there's still unearthing records, so the truth remains to be seen fully. But to sum things up, by 1881, after some of the controversies that the federal after some of the controversies surrounding the fact that the federal government had decided that only one Christian group would be allowed per reservation, that stirred up some controversy. So by 1881, the federal government rescinded that policy. So, because of this, there begins an aggressive competition between the various Christian groups over resources and land. Now, both the Jesuits and the Bureau of Catholic Indian Missions were themselves aggressively acquiring land on the Pine Ridge Reservation, to the point that one of the Jesuits was concerned that the native people themselves would begin to see them simply as land sharks. The image that I have here to the right is a image again that I borrowed from Miss Gabrielle, and you can see it's on the Pine Ridge reservations, and it was from the Jesuits' own depictions of where they were setting up churches and missions and where they were acquiring land. Now, based on the work that Truth and Healing Initiative is doing, it seems more likely that the main reason that the Holy Rosary Mission stayed open in those first years was due to the federal funding. So, of course, while they are in some ways self-sufficient, they would. It doesn't seem like they would have survived without federal funding, which is sort of a key here because the funds were allocated based on the contracts of the amount of enrolled students that one had. So basically, between the work of the Jesuits, the Bureau of Catholic Indian Missions, and the parents themselves who wanted their children to go to the Catholic schools, the Catholics were dominating enrollments and consequently receiving the most funds. By 1890, more funds went to the Catholic schools than all of the Protestant denominations combined. In response to this, the Office of Indian Affairs, known to have several prominent anti-Catholics in its ranks, worked diligently to stop the federal funding to to all private missions, but specifically their aim was to hit the Catholic missions because when you take away the option of the private school, the only thing that's left is the public schools. And the public schools at this time were by default Protestant. So to remove private funding, the children would by default end up in Protestant schools. In 1900, their lobbying efforts were successful enough and all funding to the Jesuit schools ceased. And this began this really convoluted back and forth where even though eventually the Catholic schools were granted funding again, there was this constant struggling against the anti-Catholics who were making as many regulations to get the children into public funded schools as possible. Now, the parents themselves knew this, and when advocating for themselves, they were vocal in their desires to have their children sent to the boarding schools. Yet still, the Protestants were successful in eventually withholding government rations from parents, as we mentioned before, as was a certain policy that they had, who sent their children to the private schools. I'm giving you kind of a cleaned up, tidy version here. It's actually even much more convoluted than all of this. Now, I have read conflicting accounts of this particular issue, and it may be based on discrepancies of which school we're looking at on which reservation. There were situations and places where children were forcibly removed from their parents and placed in the boarding schools, or they were coerced enough that they were left with no other option but to. There are also situations where the parents fought to have their children sent to specific schools of their choosing. This is a time when they're moving from the teepee to the cabin life. The homes that they're living in were often, more often than not, without heating, without plumbing, without electricity, occasionally, without chairs, certainly without desks for a student, for the sort of standard thing that a student would need to do their studying at home. So the parents were really left with no other option but to send their children to these boarding schools. Now, while you do have adult natives later in life Some of them had really wonderful memories of life in this boarding schools. Many of them also didn't. So often a parent would choose to send their child to these schools where the resources were available. And of course, with the way that the government system was set up, they would want a child in the public schools where they had the most assertive control over the assimilation process. But as we're discussing, they always had ways to ensure that at least minimal assimilation was taking place on the reservation schools that they were funding. According to the children themselves, as adults, this was probably the most traumatizing thing of this entire era. To go from this life where, as far back as your people can recount, the family was the bond of everything. Many Europeans admired the degree to which the native peoples kept their familial bonds intact and strong and enduring. I mean, some of these tribes, it's quite a phenomenal thing. Some of these tribes, the length of times that the tribes sustained themselves from generation to generation is, we're talking centuries, if not millennia. So if you yourself have children, think about what a horrendous thing it would be to have them removed from your care, sent to this place where they're going to be traumatized from the just the separation alone. Leave any particular abuse that may take place aside. That separation was enough that if you talk to these people today or talk to their descendants, many of them, even though probably elderly now, still feel that feeling of loss remains within them. Now, I do believe that children were forcibly taken in situations where the government authorities felt it benefited the policy. I don't know if it was a systematic thing in this situation here with the Holy Rosary mission. At least in the case of this specific example, I think probably more often than not, the parents, in the best light, wanted their children to get a Catholic education. In the worst light, the parents were really left with no other option but to send them. It was the best of worst. It was the best of really bad options. Though with all this, I'll say as new info comes in, I'm always willing to change my position based on that, whatever direction the unearthing of these archives show. I will move and adjust my opinion based on whatever anything which comes out. I feel like to do this one justice, we would have to put ourselves within the context of how the schools in general were run in those days when we talk about the treatment of children in those days. Now, while I don't think it excuses all actions by far, it does shed some light on the why. My great grandfather founded a school in the 19 teens, the 1920s. I have memories of my grandfather telling me, if you could imagine my grandfather, his father was the principal of the school. My grandfather telling me that his father, my great grandfather, would walk around the school with a paddle. Corporal punishment was the norm in these days. Though there was a story where a Jesuit, an elder Jesuit, witnessed a younger novice Jesuit beating a child to the point that it was brought on disciplinary action against the younger Jesuit. And we have to wonder how often in the heat of these moments where somebody, my it was known, my grandfather explicitly told me that my great grandfather had much self-restraint when it came to actually using that paddle. Whereas you would just have to assume that there's certain people among these adults that don't have that kind of restraint, and what kind of experiences were these children subjected to at those times where maybe they weren't lucky enough to have a superior older Jesuit sort of catch that kind of thing happening. We know that running away was common. As well, we have the Jesuits themselves complaining that at times the younger ones, especially the boys, were really not interested in their studying. And really going back to that WASP versus the traditional Lakota way of life, can you really blame them? I mean, I would be somewhat jealous if my dad's youth resembled more of something like Huck Finn than a boarding school. You really can imagine why some of these young boys would not be interested in this type of learning, and where they would run away. Now, the nuns in particular are known at this time for their disciplinarian tendencies. These nuns, in particular, these sisters of Saint Francis, they had moved from Europe. They come right to the reservations, and we noted that they were tasked with specific assimilation measures that they were going to follow. And they were often at times the most rigorous in following this English only policy, for example, where on the boarding school grounds, Lakota language was not to be um, used. And this is across the board for all of the schools. When they talk about that Pratt kill the Indian, save the man, one of the assimilation practices was that you were not allowed to speak the native language that your people spoke. You were to speak English only. Now, of course, in practice, some of this might look a little bit different. I mean, Father Bouchel, Jesuit on the in the Holy Rosary missions, children later, as adults, remembered that at recess he would speak to them in Lakota, and he was compiling a Lakota dictionary that he was putting together, and he would get these children to speak to him in Lakota, and he would learn words from them, and they have fond memories of that. Now, by the 1920s and 30s, just to give some historical context to this, you begin to receive a greater influx of American Jesuits that really showed much less interest in learning the Lakota language. In 1907, um, the Jesuits detached the Holy Rosary Mission from their German province and brought it over to the California province, where it was at that point became a American Jesuit institution. And by the 1930s, the German Jesuits, what were left of them, were aging out. And because of their advancing years, they really started to give the control over to the American Jesuits. And at this point, most of the children that are coming into the schools are already speaking English. They would be bilingual. So there was less of a necessity, whereas this earlier generation of Jesuits had incentive to learn Lakota. This incoming group of Jesuits had less incentive and really showed less interest in learning Lakota. Now, some of the American Jesuits at the Holy Rosary and St. Francis missions did learn Lakota, and the elder Lakota people, usually you could tell from what the archives um, say, that the elders were appreciative of this. I also want to point out that these were dormitories where the children stayed at. They were often just wide open rooms with a series of bunk beds, almost like you would see in a military barracks. And the children lived there, they stayed there with the religious. And as Maka Black Elk said quite poignantly, that you cannot separate the sex abuse crisis in Indian country from the boarding school era. They are they are linked together. And the adults here had unfettered access to vulnerable children. As well, older children had access to younger children. And with the abuse scandal, many of you are already familiar of that. This touches back into this time. South Dakota diocese later on would actually have to file bankruptcy due to the payouts from the abuse scandal. And as pointed out, you cannot separate the two: the abuse that took place from the access that these adults had to these children. One thing that's still ongoing is the search for missing children. How many there were, where they ended up. One disturbing rumor is that there may be unmarked graves in the area. And even one such rumor that there are some in the basement of the Red Cloud School to this day. Though they are doing the ground penetrating radar search right now to see what exactly is there. As of the recording of this video, we still await the results of this research. So what happened? How did all of this happen? I can't say I have satisfying answers here, and that might be a horrible thing for a YouTube presenter to admit. I certainly don't have answers for the other reservations or for the Protestant schools or the public schools. I wish I did. Some of this is just going to take time to uncover. The work in some places is being done. We know it's being done at Red Cloud School. And I don't want to use this opportunity that I have here to tell this story to speculate too much when not all the information is at hand yet. I can say a few things, maybe of what I think is happening, but at best, they may come to be obsolete in the coming years. But a few ideas that I have that just come to mind, just about the Jesuit missions in particular. Now, the Jesuits, we've discussed this, if you're aware, were phenomenally successful at enculturating and adopting local customs and norms. And this is really just across the board with the Jesuits. We discussed it in early previous videos. That's what the Jesuits were known for. And they certainly weren't paragons of American society and values. In fact, they are seen as opposed to everything that America stood for. They're often demonized because of this. The Jesuitical conspiracies, just start searching on YouTube. You'll find that stereotype of the Jesuits within U.S. Protestant circles still exists. And yet, the American Catholicism experiment is a messy thing, and it's been that way since the beginning. And I would recommend going to. I have a video on this channel, the Eastern Catholics in America. If you want to go back and just see how kind of messy the situation for American Catholics is, go back and watch that video because I go into it at length. The assimilation, I'm not even talking about the assimilation of Native Americans here. I'm talking about the Catholics that come to America. There's no clear assimilation plan. And again, I go to it at length in that video. Go watch that video. Because of that, there are changing changing mindsets and changing attitudes about how American Catholics are supposed to relate to the American culture at large. And something seems to have changed in the overall approach of the Jesuits towards the Lakota people. I can't say I know exactly what that change is. Maybe in time we'll get an idea as some of the correspondence maybe is translated or some of those archives are opened up. Something about that mindset seems to have changed at that time. Another thing is just the funding issue. A few slides back, we discussed that sort of deal with the devil, where the Catholics are saying, how do we keep this mission alive? Well, to keep this mission alive, we have to make this deal with the United States government. To make this deal with the United States government is going to put us at odds with what's in the best interests of the Native American people. And that's again, that's a messy situation. And I don't claim to sit here and have a good answer for how that should have been handled. Do the Jesuits make a stand and say, we're not going to accept that money? And in the meantime, the missions get closed down, and you may never even have a Catholic presence among the Lakota. I don't know. I don't know what to say about that. Um, Now, I know on a positive spin, one of the things that the Jesuits were concerned about was that they wanted the Native American children to have a chance to assimilate into American society for the sake of social mobility, because their concern was that these children would grow up and remain destitute and in poverty if there wasn't a degree of assimilation where they could function in the American society. And that I understand, but I still think there's a balance between that and allowing these children to keep some of their cultural identity. There also is some possible greed over the land accumulation. Again, the work on that needs to continue to be done. As far as the graves go, I know at times epidemics overwhelmed some towns. Mass graves in those times become common. But my question is, and I'm certainly no expert in what's going on in Canada, and that's work for other people to do. What did the parents know about this? Did the parents know the fate of their children? Were the parents informed? Did the parents consent to these mass graves? I don't know. The other thing that we can say, that I can say here, is that children should always have adult oversight when left alone with other adults. And these are modern lessons learned. They wouldn't have considered this at the time. Personally, from what I know of the Irish boarding schools and the English boarding schools back over in the old country, boarding schools in general are a horrible idea. They were a horrible idea from the get-go, and we know today that that is a cocktail for disaster when you leave these children alone with people that are not their parents or that don't have the oversight of other independent adults that aren't um, in any way have ties or connections to the other adults that are involved in supervising these children. If you've been trained at all in the virtues training, you'll know what I mean by that. One interesting thing I want to bring up here, and this comes from Brett Salkeld's article he wrote, that's called "Guilt, Responsibility, and Purgatory: How Traditional Catholic Teaching Can Help Us Think About Truth, Reconciliation, and Reparations." And what he does is he takes a theological approach to answering why this whole thing was wrong and why it's against traditional Catholic teaching, and why the Catholic Church never should have been involved in it in both Canada and the United States. And the 2 points that he brings up that it's a failure of is, one, the principle of subsidiarity from the Catechism of the Catholic Church, 1883. A community of the subsidiarity is a community of a higher order should not interfere in the internal life of a community of a lower order, depriving the latter of its functions, but rather should support it in the case of need and help to coordinate its activities with the activities of the rest of society. always with a view to the common good. So basically, what that's saying is we should not have allowed the US government to dictate what's best for these people on the level that they're living in, where you have an agency man over in DC working with a bureau man for the Catholic agencies, who in turn are dictating what's coming down the pike for the missions. The missions themselves on the ground should have been more responsible for what was happening in the schools. And beyond that, the parents themselves should have had much more responsibility and ability to be involved in what's happening in the schools and what's happening with their children. The second thing is, and this is another interesting one that would take maybe somebody with a little bit more theological acumen on this, with especially with this biblical knowledge, is the it goes against the decrees of the Council of Jerusalem from the Book of Acts, where the Judaizing heresy was condemned. And basically, what that was there are certain practices of the Gentiles that the Judaizers wanted to prohibit. Now, whilst at the council it was determined that some of those practices were to be prohibited, but they were not to be forced, the Gentiles, that is, were not to be forced to conform to the Jewish Old Testament rituals of circumcision and the dietary habits. And so ultimately, what this is saying is that the Catholic Church, while there are certainly some practices when we come into a culture that are going to be prohibited, we are still not to force them to conform to our cultural norms. Going all the way back to the very beginning, this is the position of the Catholic Church. So to be involved in that in the boarding schools is a failure of us keeping with our traditional Catholic teaching. Moving forward, well, we're going to talk about moving forward next week, about some of the ways that we can do that, including some of the ways that it's already being done. And I'm going to save what moving forward could look like till next week when we discuss it. But I just want to say I hope I did this some justice, where I have maybe brought light to the truth. It's all due to the work of God. Where I have failed in this, the faults are my own and I own them. And this is a serious subject that I do believe that more of you should be aware of. I don't want it to be used for anything scandalizing. I don't want it to be used for sensationalizing or any of these things that you see some other channels do. But I do want to see healing. These are, as you can probably tell, these are people that I hold near and dear to me, that I care about. I care about all of my Catholic brothers and sisters out there, no matter where they come from. And when they suffer, we suffer. So, as far as what moving forward is going to look like, we're going to talk about modern Lakota Catholicism and what it looks like today next week. So, stay tuned for that. If you enjoyed this video, I say enjoy very lightly. If you learned something from this video, if you found it helpful, please like, subscribe to the channel, share the video with others, and I will see you next time. God bless you all.